Okay, thank you everyone for joining us today. Today we're going to talk about world history prophesied through Daniel the prophet. So we've got a very interesting subject to look at today, world history and how it was prophesied many thousands of years ago by the biblical prophet Daniel. So who was Daniel the prophet? Daniel was a Jewish prophet. The Jewish people were forcibly displaced from their land by the Babylonian Empire in centuries before the birth of Christ. And among those taken to Babylon was a Jewish prophet named Daniel. So we know today the Jewish people live in the land of Israel, and they've lived here, as we would know from the history of the current conflict, on and off for thousands of years. So at this particular time, the Jews were living in the land of Israel, but the Babylonian Empire, the great empire to the north of that particular time, forcibly displaced the Jewish people, and they took many of them away to Babylon. And among those who was taken to Babylon was a Jewish prophet named Daniel. Daniel was soon noticed when he arrived in Babylon by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar because of his accurate prophecies. And Daniel claimed in the prophecies he made to be inspired by the only true God. So this is something that really would have stood out in Babylon. We know that the city of Babylon has been excavated today, and like many of its cities of the time, it was a city that was built around the worship of many different gods. But Daniel claimed to be a prophet of the only true God. And many of the words of Daniel we have recorded for us in the book of Daniel in the Bible. So if you've got a Bible with you might like to open up to the book of Daniel, and we'll be looking at some of those prophecies that Daniel gave, some of those prophecies that attracted the attention of the king Nebuchadnezzar. And these prophecies are very exciting prophecies because we can look at them with the benefit of hindsight and see that most of what Daniel wrote about has happened, and extremely accurately as well. But there's also some things that we can see happening in the world right now. And there's things that Daniel tells us will happen in the future. So that's what the book of Daniel's all about. It takes up about 12 short chapters, a fairly small section of the Bible, and in it there's a number of prophecies. And we just want to look at the first of those prophecies today, which is recorded in Daniel chapter 2. And the book of Daniel chapter 2 describes how King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Babylonian Empire, had a dream. And Nebuchadnezzar was the greatest king of the Babylonian Empire. He was one of the kings who really founded the empire, and during his reign as king, he received a number of dreams or visions from God. And Daniel chapter 2 describes the first one of these. So Nebuchadnezzar had this dream, and he knew it wasn't just an ordinary dream. There must have been something different about it. And he recognised it as, although he didn't understand who the Jewish God was, the God of Daniel, he recognised it as a message from a higher power. He could see it was different to the dreams he'd had in the past. And so he called all his religious people, his priests, his fortune tellers, his astrologers, all those people, and he said, I've had this dream. There was something different about it and I want to know what it means. But none of them were able to interpret the dream. And so eventually Nebuchadnezzar the king came in contact with Daniel the prophet, and Nebuchadnezzar thought he was the most powerful man ever and that his kingdom would last forever. And that's what this dream was really all about. Nebuchadnezzar was a great king, and he built much of what the city of Babylon is known for even today. And because of that, he thought that his kingdom, the kingdom that he had built in Babylon, would last forever. And so God sent him a dream to show him that he, King Nebuchadnezzar, wasn't actually the most important person at all, and that the kingdom he had built was only one of the kingdoms of men, as God called it, but God was far more powerful, and that he was the one that was in control in the kingdoms of men. So that's what this dream that Nebuchadnezzar had was all about. In this dream, the king saw a huge statue or an image, and the king described how he saw this dream. Initially, he called all his wise men and he asked them to interpret it for him. He said the thing had gone from him, and he asked them to tell him about what the dream was and what it meant. Whether he'd really forgotten it, as sometimes we do after we wake up from having a dream and he couldn't remember all the details, or whether he was testing his own men out to see how good they really were at interpreting the dream. It's a bit hard to tell for sure, but either way, he first called all his priests, his astrologers, all his wise people, and asked them to explain the dream, and they couldn't. And that's when the king was introduced to Daniel. And so initially the king's astrologers said to him, they said, "We can't tell you this. Nobody's ever asked for this before," they said. If you look at Daniel chapter 2, verse 10, the Chaldeans answered before the king and said, "There is not a man upon the earth that can show the king's matter." They said, "You're asking for something that nobody else can do." They said, "There's no king, no lord, nor ruler that asks such things at any magician or astrologer or Chaldean." The Chaldeans were the people who lived in the area of Chaldea, and particularly maybe the wise men in that area, Chaldea, or as we know it today, Babylon. So they said that they couldn't help the king with what he was asking for. But then along came Daniel, and Daniel spoke to the king, and he said in verse 19, the secret was revealed to Daniel in a vision. So the God of heaven, the God who Daniel was a prophet for, the one true God, explained the vision to him in verse 19. It says, Daniel chapter 2, verse 19, "Then was the secret revealed unto Daniel in a night vision. And then Daniel blessed the God of heaven." So after having had the vision revealed to him, Daniel then went before the king, and he said, "I will tell you the interpretation of this dream, king." But he said, "It's not really me. I'm giving you a message from God." If you look at Daniel 2, verse 24, this is what Daniel said. "Therefore Daniel went in unto the king, unto Arioch, whom the king had ordained to destroy the wise men of Babylon. And he went and said unto him, Destroy not the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show the interpretation. I will show unto the king the interpretation." And so Daniel said, "If you bring me to the king, I can explain this dream he's had." And so Arioch brought Daniel into the king. Arioch, the servant of the king, brought in Daniel. And in verse 28, Daniel spoke to the king, and he said to Nebuchadnezzar, he said, "There is a God in heaven that reveals secrets, and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. Thy dream and the visions of thy head upon thy bed are these." So Daniel said something very interesting to the king about this dream. He said, "It's not something that's happening now, king, it's something that's going to happen later on." He calls the time the latter days. And so Daniel said, in the latter days, that's what this dream's about. And then he went on to explain what the dream was. He said, "This is what you saw, king," verse 29. "As for thee, O king, thy thoughts came into thy mind upon thy bed, what should come to pass hereafter. And he that revealeth secrets maketh known to thee what shall come to pass." So God, who's the one that reveals secrets, God, who is the true God in heaven, the one who Daniel was a prophet for, revealed the secrets. And then he continued in verse 31 of Daniel chapter 2. "And he said, Thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible." So here we've got on the right-hand side a suggestion of what the king might have seen in his dream. We don't know exactly what it looked like, but it was a huge image or a statue. Maybe it looked like a warrior or something like that. But the unusual thing about this warrior, as Daniel went on to explain, was that it was made of different metals. Verse 32 says that the head was gold. So first up it had a head of gold. this head of gold was joined to a chest and arms of silver, as verse 32 describes it. The head was of fine gold, the breast and arms of silver, his belly and thighs of brass, his legs of iron, and his feet part of iron and part of clay. So this image was bright, it was terrible, and it was scary. And not only that, it was built in a very unusual way. There's no way that that image could have naturally stood up on its feet. The feet, which were supposed to be the strongest part, were a mixture of iron and clay, which obviously didn't mix very well. And the heaviest part of the image was at the top, the golden head. So there was something very unusual about this dream, and clearly it worried King Nebuchadnezzar. And so what God was actually trying to tell Nebuchadnezzar is that he wasn't actually the greatest and most powerful person ever, that there would be other people that would come after him. And Daniel continued on and he explained this to the king. He said, when the image was all standing up on its feet, it said a stone came out and destroyed the whole image, and not only it knocked it over and it smashed it up. Verse 34, Daniel said to the king, thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon its feet, that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. So the stone appeared out of nowhere. It was cut out without hands, and it hit the image, it smashed it up, and it broke it. And then Daniel proceeded, and no doubt the king would have sat there in amazement, realising that what Daniel described was exactly what he dreamt. And then Daniel proceeded to give the explanation of what the dream meant. In verse 36 of Daniel 2, if you're still following through this particular prophecy, Daniel said, this is the dream, and he said, now we will tell the interpretation before the king. In verse 37, he says, thou, O king, art a king of kings, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, and strength and glory. So no doubt that would have made Nebuchadnezzar feel pretty good. He thought he was the greatest person who'd ever lived. He thought he was the one who built this great city of Babylon completely through his own strength. But Daniel continued on. And at the end of verse 38, he said to Nebuchadnezzar, thou art this head of gold. You're the golden head, Nebuchadnezzar. But you're not going to be king forever, and your kingdom's not going to last forever, he explained. In verse 39, Daniel said, there shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee, and another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth. So Daniel described how Nebuchadnezzar wouldn't last forever. Another kingdom would take over. It would be inferior to the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar, at least in terms of magnificence. It controlled a bigger area than Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, but in terms of magnificence it was inferior to Nebuchadnezzar's. And then along would come a third kingdom which would control a bigger area again. It would bear rule over all the earth. Not all the literal world, but certainly all the part of the world that was known to King Nebuchadnezzar at that time. And then Daniel continued, the fourth kingdom, which shall be as strong as iron, for as much as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things, and as iron that breaketh in pieces shall it break in piece and bruise. So Daniel said there's going to be another kingdom going to come after the brass one. It will be a strong kingdom. It will break in pieces and bruise everything. But then that kingdom wouldn't last forever either. Verse 41 describes how that the feet and the toes would be part of potter's clay and part of iron. And Daniel said the kingdom will be divided. There shall be in it of the strength of the iron, for as much as thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay. And as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. So Daniel described how another kingdom would come. And it wouldn't be just one single kingdom, it would be a mix of different kingdoms. And verse 44 describes how in the days of these kings, so it's not just one king, there's a number of kings now, and in those days, Daniel says, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. So that was Daniel's prophecy. That was the dream that he saw. he saw a statue that was made out of different metals: gold, silver, brass, iron, and then the feet a mixture of iron and clay. And eventually this statue was destroyed by a stone. So the king had many of his own prophets, as we've seen, but they couldn't explain the dream. Their explanations didn't make sense. They couldn't even tell Nebuchadnezzar the king what his dream was. But Daniel explained that this dream he'd seen spoke about different Middle Eastern empires. So then what did the dream mean? Daniel's already told us what the golden head meant: Babylon. And anyone who's looked at the history of the time will know that Babylon, the Babylonian Empire, was overthrown by the Persian Empire. That lasted for a while, and then it was overthrown by the Greek Empire. And these first three empires, they changed hands quite quickly in a short period of time. There were a few decisive battles that led to the Persians taking over, a few more decisive battles which led to the Greeks taking over from the Persians. And so particularly those first three empires passed one from the other to the next, and that comes out quite clearly in history at the time. And even today it's recognised that there have only ever really been four great empires in the Middle East. There have been a few other powers that have been there for a time, but only really four great empires: the Babylonians, the Persian Empire, and the Greek Empire. And then there was a time period where the Greek Empire gradually lost its power and influence and eventually was taken over by the Roman Empire. And that lasted until a few hundred years after the birth of Christ, and then the Roman Empire collapsed. And since that time, there's never really been one great empire that's ruled over that area. The Roman Empire was the last of the great empires, and again that's very well recognised in the history of the area. And there were, of course, many other empires in other parts of the world. There were the great empires, great dynasties in China. There was the Mongol Empire and many others. But this prophecy is particularly talking about that Middle Eastern area, the area where the kingdom of Babylon was established, and the area where Daniel the prophet himself lived, the land of Israel, and where all of the events that we read about in the Bible happened. This is a prophecy about that particular area of the world. And interestingly, it has been the Middle East and things that have happened there which have had perhaps the greatest impact on history down through time. And so this dream was a prophecy about that particular area. And then after the Roman Empire, of course, we've then got this period where there's the feet of iron and clay. And as Daniel said to the king, there wasn't going to be any one strong empire. There'd be some strong countries, some weaker countries. There'd be a mix of strong and weak countries. And the influence of the Roman Empire obviously remained, and we can see that today. The Roman influence is still there today. Religion, the Roman Church, the Catholic Church, is still a big influence in the world today. The Roman system of government still influences the way many countries run today. Roman laws still influence the way many things run today. So that Roman influence is still there, just as Daniel said in his dream. So this dream, I believe, was an incredibly accurate prophecy about what would happen over time, down through time. And the reason God gave this dream to Nebuchadnezzar was to tell him that he wasn't as important as he thought, that there would be many other kingdoms that would come after him. But the reason it's interesting to us is the accuracy of the prophecy. And really what we've got here is a timeline of the history of the Middle East from King Nebuchadnezzar's time, around 500 BC, right through to our time now. It's universally recognised that these four empires we've just talked about were the major and most influential powers in the Middle Eastern world. Since the fall of the Roman Empire, there's been no major empire in this part of the world. And so now we're living right at the end of this, in the time of the feet and the time of the stone. So the stone is the only part of the dream still to happen. So, as we've said, this part of the dream is still future. Daniel said that the God of heaven is going to set up a kingdom. That hasn't happened yet. So that's where we're living right now in this dream. We're living at that time. Daniel said that this kingdom will be more powerful than all of the other kingdoms. And unlike those other kingdoms, it would be a kingdom that would fill the whole earth. And a kingdom, unlike Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, that would last forever. So the image in this dream was destroyed by a stone, and that's how Daniel described that part that was still to happen. So we might think, well, how do we know that's going to happen? Can there really be a kingdom set up that's going to destroy all the other kingdoms and replace it with something better, something that lasts forever? But if we look at this dream, it's been an incredibly accurate prophecy of what's happened down through time, hasn't it? And if we look at it a little bit more closely, it really is a very accurate description of what's happened down through time. Even non-Christian historians recognise that there have been 4 great empires in the Middle East. The head of the image was gold. As we said, that was Babylon, and that was the metal that Babylon was known for. That was the time when the prophecy was made. But look at what comes next. This was all predicted years in advance, hundreds of years in advance. The Persian bit of the empire, the silver bit, the silver chest, was inferior to the Babylonian Empire. And there were 2 arms. The Persian Empire, today we generally call it the Persian Empire, but it started off in the area of Media, which was in the area of probably Iran today. And the Persian, it was an alliance between the Medians, or the Medes, and the Persians. And the Persians gradually gained control, and so today we know it more as the Persian Empire. But it really started up as two countries who were in alliance together, like the 2 arms, the silver chest with the 2 arms. It was followed by the Greeks, and this time is known in history as the Bronze Age. Very interesting that the metal that just happened to be in the dream for the Bronze Age was Greece. Again, it's very accurate, hundreds of years before it happened. Rome was known for developing iron, and in the dream, iron was the metal that happened to symbolise Rome. Again, Rome was known because it split into 2. Over time, it developed into 2 empires, or 2 parts of the empire, 2 branches of the empire. There was an Eastern Empire and a Western Empire. The Western Roman Empire, of course, was centred in Rome, and the eastern part of it was centred in Constantinople. So again, an extremely accurate prophecy. And so this is what should make it interesting for us and make us realise that perhaps the things that have been prophesied, we can have just as much confidence in them as well. And the Roman influence, just as this dream said, has remained ever since that time. We see it in our society today, don't we? It's all been prophesied very accurately. And so this can give us confidence about the last part of the message, and that's what we read in chapter 2, verse 44. Daniel said to the king, in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. So God's going to set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed. And we'll just turn to one other prophecy in the Bible about this time. There's many prophecies about this time we're talking about, and for this we'll go outside the book of Daniel, just so we can see a bit more about what the kingdom of God that he's going to set up is going to be like. And this is our hope. This is what God's promised to us. He's promised us that Jesus will come back to the earth. He's promised a future that all of us can be part of, and he's promised us a hope of living forever. And it's not going to be a kingdom like the 4 that have gone before, the 4 other great empires. It's going to be a changed world, a world full of suffering, a changed world, a world free of suffering and death. Not like the previous empires. There's going to be a changed world, one that's free of suffering and one that's completely free of death. And the previous empires brought death and destruction. There were many battles going on between them, and many people died. Millions of people lost their lives. But the kingdom of God is going to be a world free of all of these things, a world free of suffering and death. So we'll just finish by looking at one other prophecy in the book of Isaiah, which describes what this coming kingdom is going to be like. When the stone strikes the image and destroys the system of things in the world today, the system of things that's been going on since the time of Nebuchadnezzar and before. And so we'll come to Isaiah chapter 2. And in Isaiah chapter 2 and verse 2, this is how Isaiah, another one of the prophets who was contemporary with Daniel, who lived about the same time, just a little bit earlier, this is how he described it. Isaiah says, "It shall come to pass in the last days." You might remember that phrase. That was what Daniel said to Nebuchadnezzar. He said, "Your dreams about the latter days," or the last days. He said, "In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow unto it. And many people shall go and say, Come ye, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem." So this prophecy describes how in the last days it says that God will establish a kingdom here on earth. And it describes how people from all over the world will go to it, and they'll want to learn about the things of God. And it continues on, and it describes how God, through his Son Jesus Christ, who will be ruling that kingdom for him on earth, it says he shall judge among nations and rebuke many people. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. So it describes how today the world is spending billions of dollars and people are dying every day in wars and in violence. But it describes how in coming times when the kingdom of God's set up, instead of putting their efforts into developing new weapons and new ways of killing people, that effort will be put into agriculture and put into making sure there's enough food for everyone, that people have what they need. It says that nation shall not lift up sword against nation, so there won't be war anymore. It's using the language of the time, of course. We know that today battles and wars are fought in very different ways. But it describes how there's a time of peace coming when that kingdom of God will fill the whole earth, when the stone in Nebuchadnezzar's dream will become a big mountain and fill the whole earth. And we've seen today how this hasn't happened yet. This part of the prophecy is about the future. But the things that have happened and the accuracy of the prophecy up until that point can give us confidence that what hasn't happened yet will too. So that's what we've got to look forward to. A very different world to the one we live in today. A world when there won't be wars and fighting anymore, when one kingdom or one empire won't be fighting to take over another, but God will set up a kingdom here on earth that will be ruled righteously. Jesus will be the king. We can all be part of it, and we have the hope of living forever in a changed and perfect world. So that's the message that Daniel the prophet gives us for the future. So thank you for joining us today as we've considered the subject of world history prophesied by Daniel. And if you've liked this talk, please make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit the bell icon so you'll be notified when the next Bible talk is uploaded. Be sure to browse our channel for other Bible talks, or you can also visit our website, launcestonchristadelphian.org.au, where you'll find links to other Bible information of interest.